Putin's decision to invade Ukraine more than 8 months ago is leading not only to the destruction of Ukraine, but to the destruction of Russia itself. Tens of thousands of people on both sides have already lost their lives over this conflict. And that's in addition to the more than 7.5 million Ukrainians who have left their country as refugees, and the more than 1 million Russians who have left theirs as exiles. On September 21st, Putin announced the first wartime mobilization of men in Russia since the Second World War, a call for at least 300,000 additional men to be drafted and sent to the front line in Ukraine to fight and potentially to die. Within hours of that announcement, the prices for flights going anywhere outside of Russia skyrocketed to never-before-seen rates, as hundreds of thousands of Russian men suddenly became desperate to leave their country and escape. But they had and continue to have very limited options for escape. For months beforehand, nearly every country in Europe and North America had blocked off their airspaces to all Russian flights, and nearly every European-based carrier had shut down their flights to Russia as well. By the time of Putin's mobilization announcement, there were only 2 European-based carriers remaining operating flights to Russia: Air Serbia out of Belgrade and Turkish Airlines out of Istanbul. For any Russians fleeing the country by commercial air to Europe, these were the only 2 choices to pick from, and so their prices temporarily exploded to more than 9,000 euros for a one-way economy fare ticket out of Moscow, which is more than half the median annual salary for everyday Russians. Most everyday Russians simply couldn't afford that high of a price to fly to Europe to escape. But it started becoming increasingly difficult to escape by land as well. By the end of September, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and even Finland had each taken the unprecedented step to completely lock their land borders down with Russia, denying anyone with Russian citizenship entry for any reason, even if they held valid visas. That meant that travel by land to Europe was also mostly impossible for Russians fleeing the country, unless, of course, they wanted to book it through the active war zone in Ukraine. The only possible land route to Europe for escaping Russians still remaining as of the production of this video is through the very narrow sliver of Norway in the far northwest of the country. Norway has still not shut down their small border here with Russia yet, and the E105 highway that leads to it beyond Murmansk continues to remain open for now. But for most Russians fleeing the consequences of this war, the route to Norway is thousands of kilometers away from them and difficult and expensive to get to. At the same time, an estimated 70% of Russian citizens don't even possess a passport that's required for international travel like this. And that means that for most Russians wanting to flee the country, their only really good options are to the south in the former Soviet countries of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Georgia, and Armenia, where they can all still enter without visas, and some even without passports. As members of the Eurasian Economic Union, basically Russia's version of the European Union, Russians entering into Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Armenia retain the right to live and work within them, making them the easiest and the cheapest countries for Russians to escape into. As a result, satellite imagery taken on September the 25th shows a huge traffic jam of desperate Russian vehicles attempting to cross the border into Georgia, potentially as long as 30 kilometers or 19 miles. In a similar fashion, queues of Russians in cars attempting to enter Kazakhstan can be seen in video clips stretching for nearly as far as the eye can see. Hundreds of thousands of Russians have already made it down to these 4 countries, and more coming down on that at least 1.2 million Russians have left the country since the invasion of Ukraine began, representing the largest exodus of Russians from the country in history since the 1917 October Revolution and the Bolshevik rise to power. And that isn't even to say anything of the unknown numbers of Russian men getting killed and maimed for life in Ukraine, which, according to US estimates, is already at least 70 to 80,000 killed and wounded, with Ukrainian losses in life probably being very similar, already making it the deadliest war seen in Europe in generations since 1945. And all of this loss of people either to warfare or to migration is only exacerbating what was already arguably Russia's and Ukraine's biggest problem before the war. Their populations were each already in a terminal decline for decades, and this war is only making that problem a lot worse. It could get so bad that within 20 years from now, we may not even recognize either Russia or Ukraine as countries in the same way we see them today, and they may no longer even exist as we know them. Let me explain a little bit what I mean. This on the left is the population pyramid of Russia, while this on the right is the population pyramid of Ukraine. These graphs are essentially a snapshot of both countries' populations that reveal the numbers of people of all ages and genders, and they both appear very similar, which is a bad thing. At the top of each, you can see these gaps in people in their 70s. The World War II generation that suffered tens of millions of people dead in both countries. To be born a boy anywhere in the Soviet Union in 1923 was perhaps the single worst time, place, and gender to have been born across most of human history. 3.4 million boys were born in the Soviet Union that year. And by the time these 3.4 million boys would be 23 years old at the end of 1946, more than 2/3 of them would already be dead. To have been born male in the Soviet Union in 1923, you had less than a 1 in 3 chance of surviving beyond your 23rd birthday. The loss in life of so many young people like this throughout the 1930s and 40s meant that a lot of young people at that time in both Ukraine and Russia were never able to have any children. And that meant the kids they never had simply didn't exist around 20 years later when they would normally also be having their own kids, causing a population hit or echo of the lost World War II generation around here in the mid to late 1960s that reduced their population equivalent of Gen Xers. These echoes of the lost World War II generation continue to ripple across both Russian and Ukrainian society about every 20 to 25 years. But the two most recent ripples hitting the Zoomers, and whatever generation is being born now will be called, have come almost precisely at times of other great national crises, which only exacerbated their problems for both countries' populations. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed just as the second echo of the lost World War II generation was starting. With the collapse in Soviet-era state services and structures came a rocketing in the rates of alcoholism, opioid use, suicides, crime, and HIV/AIDS that plagued the populations of both Ukraine and Russia alike for years afterwards, and caused each of their life expectancies, especially for men, to plummet. Throughout the mid-1990s and early 2000s, the life expectancy for Russian and Ukrainian men alike were 17 years fewer than men over in Western Europe, and 13 years fewer than their female counterparts. They were nearly on a par with men in Afghanistan and many sub-Saharan African nations despite being at peace. And at the same time, rates of migration abroad following the collapse of the Iron Curtain and communism exploded, as millions of Ukrainians and Russians sought out better opportunities for themselves and their families abroad over in the West. And simultaneously as the death and migration rates were skyrocketing in the 90s, the numbers of births to replace them were plummeting, a situation which continues to this day. Ukrainian women, even before the invasion, were only having an average of 1.16 children each, the second lowest rate of births anywhere in the world, just behind South Korea, and well beneath the natural population replacement level of 2.1 births per woman. And unlike many Western countries that make up for their own low levels of births with high levels of immigration, Ukraine has had a net negative rate of migration for decades, with many times more people leaving every year than entering. So naturally, as a result of all these factors, the population of Ukraine has literally decreased every single year since 1993, down from a peak of nearly 52 million people right at the end of the Cold War to just over 41 million immediately before the invasion, when also factoring in the 2.5 million people in Crimea who were lost to the Russians in 2014. Overall, this represents a crash of nearly 20% of the Ukrainian population in only 30 years. And Russia's situation isn't that much better. Plagued with largely the same societal and medical issues as Ukraine following the Soviet collapse, in the 30 years now since 1992, Russia has only ever seen 3 years of population growth between 2013 and 2015, while every single other year has been nothing but continuous decline. With a current birth rate of 1.5 children per woman overall, and a slightly positive immigration rate of people mostly coming from Central Asia, the Russians have been losing people at a slower rate than Ukraine, but they've still been losing people. And the official numbers of births across Russia are also fairly deceiving, because Russia is a multi-ethnic country, and the ethnic Russians themselves are having far fewer children than their ethnic minorities are. That means the largest loss of people ever in Russia during peacetime, and the largest loss in general since the Second World War. And now, in 2022, with the unleashing of the biggest war seen in Russia and Ukraine since the Second World War, this population problem for both of them that has been going on for the past 30 years now is only going to get way worse than it even already was. For Ukraine, at least 7.6 million people have evacuated the country and become refugees since the invasion began, meaning that nearly 1 in 5 Ukrainians before the invasion have left the country in less than 8 months. That is a similar loss in population that Ukraine experienced over 30 years between the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Russian invasion itself, and implies that there's only around 33.5 million Ukrainians remaining within the country right now, nearly 20 million less than there were immediately after the Soviet collapse. And of course, that is to say nothing of the unknown numbers of Ukrainian soldiers and civilians alike who have lost their lives or become catastrophically injured since the invasion began, which is almost certainly a very high number stretching into the tens to hundreds of thousands. Ukraine will never be the same again after this war is over, even if they do push all the way ahead to ultimate victory. And while the raw numbers of Russia's exiles leaving the country are nowhere near as large or catastrophic as Ukraine's refugees, they're still pretty bad for Russia's internal demographics. Remember that the vast majority of the 1.2 million Russians who have already left so far are either highly educated or young, and especially are young men. As the war in Ukraine continues to drag on and casualties continue to mount up, Putin will be forced into calling in more draftees and conscripts to replace the losses. And that means that more and more draft-age men are going to be leaving the country to escape it. In order to stop them from leaving, Russia will eventually be left with little other choice than to shut down their borders completely like during the Soviet era, and dramatically increase repression and surveillance at home, which will lead to people becoming even more desperate to leave and escape as Russia descends more and more into the authoritarianism and even totalitarianism of the past. Russia has already lost more people this year than it has in any other year since World War II, breaking its own record for that was only set last year in 2021. How many more will it and Ukraine lose by the time the war is over? And will either of them, with historically low birth and migration rates, ever be able to actually recover?